So welcome to the City of North Vancouver's Electric Vehicle Ready webinar. My name is Larissa Lensing, and I'm a planner with the city in the environmental sustainability team. I would like to start by acknowledging that this webinar is hosted on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and we are grateful and committed to learning from these peoples who steward this land well. We're excited to be hosting tonight's webinar and to be offering top-up rebates through the Clean BC Go Electric program for EV-ready plans and infrastructure. Supporting residents to access at-home charging in multi-unit residential buildings is a priority for the city, where the majority of city residents live in apartment and condo buildings. This webinar and the top-up rebates are part of the city's efforts to accelerate zero-emission vehicle adoption in the city, which is an important component of achieving our climate targets, as transportation is the single biggest source of carbon pollution in the city. So before we get started, there's a couple of housekeeping items to get through. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the city's website after the webinar. During the webinar, your cameras and microphones will remain off and your name and email will be hidden from other attendees. If you have issues with audio during the webinar, you can call using your phone to the number on the screen, which is also in the email registration that you received. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation, so you can submit your questions as they come up using the Q&A function, selecting the presenter and host option, and we will answer them at the end. If you have issues accessing the Q&A, you can also email questions to evcharging@cnv.org. And finally, at the end of the webinar, you will be directed on your browser to a survey to collect feedback. It should only take a couple minutes to answer, and we would really appreciate your feedback. To get started, we have a quick poll just to have a better sense of who's attending tonight. So I'm going to launch that, and if you don't mind filling it out, we can get a sense of who's in the room tonight. Just give it a couple more seconds here. So you should be able to see the results on the screen. So it looks like a lot of Strata Council members, Strata owners, and a lot of a sort of mixture of EV owners and people considering and planning in the near future. Great, thank you for participating in that. You should be able to close it on your end. So now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Brendan McEwen. Brendan is a managing consultant with Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors. Brendan has a wealth of experience with EV-ready infrastructure and planning. In particular, Brendan developed the first 100% EV-ready residential parking requirements for new construction in North America. And he also helped designing the Clean BC EV-ready rebate program for multi-unit residential buildings. So we're very excited to have him tonight and to learn from his expertise. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Brendan.
Oh, great. Okay. Thanks so much, Larissa, and thanks to all of you participants who joined the webinar today to chat about how to implement EV-ready upgrades in multifamily condominiums. So just to start off, if you take nothing else away from my talk today, you should know that there are a great set of rebates offered to support EV charging infrastructure in a range of building types. For this audience, the most important is in multifamily condos as well as rental buildings that are supported through the Green BC Go Electric, Clean BC Go Electric EV charger rebates program. So this is a program funded by the province of BC and administered by BC Hydro. And as Larissa noted, the city offers top-ups for the EV Ready rebate program for multifamily condos and apartments. And I'll be saying a lot more about that program in particular as part of my talk today. So as Larissa mentioned, I'm a managing consultant at Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors. We work with different levels of government, with utilities, and with the corporate and nonprofit sectors to advance the energy transition, thinking about how we're going to decarbonize buildings, mobility, and energy systems. And what I would like to speak with you about today, this will probably be about 35 minutes worth of content, is summarized right here. I'll just provide a really quick overview of trends in the EV space and a backgrounder in EV charging and what we mean by EV ready parking. And then I'll say a little bit about EV energy management systems, which are a category of technologies that are important to enable large proportions of parking spaces to be able to ultimately have EV charging at them, and about EV charging service providers that work with multifamily buildings and help them implement EV charging at scale on their properties. Really real quickly, just touch base on and inform this audience about what's happening in new construction throughout the region, because that's an important consideration for how to keep your properties competitive. And then I'll spend most of my remarks speaking about how to make existing buildings EV ready, what are supporting incentive programs, notably BC's EV Ready rebate program, and provide a little bit of guidance in terms of how to think about implementing an EV ready upgrade in your building. So in terms of trends in the EV space, basically battery prices are declining significantly, and that is making EVs increasingly cost competitive. They're already more cost competitive on a life cycle basis than internal combustion vehicles. There's still a premium upfront, but as battery prices continue to decline, we're going to see that upfront premium actually go away. So EVs will cost the same amount upfront and subsequently lower. And that should happen sometime in the mid 2020s to 2030 or so. So at that point, you're going to have vehicles that are much lower cost to operate, as well as lower cost upfront, zero tailpipe emissions. It's difficult to understand why people are going to want to keep purchasing internal combustion vehicles. And beyond that kind of technology and economic story, policy is driving rapid EV adoption. Notably, the province of BC has announced that it's going to update its Zero Emissions Vehicle Act that's going to require that 90% of all the vehicles sold by 2030 and 100% of vehicles sold by 2035 are zero emissions, so electric vehicles. So we have both these kind of technology and policy drivers working together that are driving this transition. And in BC, as of Q3 2022, about 18% of all vehicles sold were electric. In Metro Vancouver as a whole, that number is more like 25%, and I'm sure it's even higher in the city of North Van. So we're actually ahead of schedule here. So I'll say a little bit about how EV charging works and how to think about making buildings EV ready. So there's broadly 3 different levels of charging stations that have been defined in a standard called the SAE J1772 standard. So level 1 is a relatively slow rate of charge. It's a 120 volt circuit, so that's the same amperage as just a household standard kind of household plug that you'd see. And it might be able to provide something like 5 kilometers, maybe if you've got quite an efficient vehicle, 8 kilometers of range per hour. Now, some households get by with that. But moving forward, especially as we get to larger EVs, most households are going to want to have access to level 2 charging. So that's the same voltage as a dryer plug or an oven plug, 208 volt or 240 volt. And amperages can range, and therefore your charging speed will range. So at the most common amperages, you might get something on the order of 50 kilometers an hour worth of range added to your vehicle for an hour that you're charging. So that's common for at-home charging as well as workplace charging. And then DC fast charging is the fastest rate of charging. This is typically not something that's going to make any sense to implement in a multifamily building, but you'll see this along highway networks or at things like Tesla supercharging stations in commercial centers. So access to at-home charging really is the most important factor moving forward to make adoption of EVs convenient, and therefore it's going to be really important to people to be able to access home charging. So it's kind of the base of what we call the charging pyramid. Right now in North America, about 80% of all charging takes place at home. There is about 15% that takes place at work, and maybe 5% that's in public areas, so when people are out and about and on the go. So these are certainly, workplace and public charging are important, but having access to charging at home is very important. Uh, Getting that kind of EV charging, if you have an on-site parking space in a single-family building, is relatively simple, but it is unfortunately a lot more complicated in multifamily buildings. So it is potentially quite costly and certainly complicated to implement EV charging in multifamily buildings. The way this has happened in most of North America and BC up until a few years ago would be incremental additions of EV chargers, just a couple at a time. And this is typically quite expensive. So the average cost in BC has been about $9,000, although it really varies in multifamily buildings per charger, per EV supply equipment or EVSE. So relatively quite costly. It's also a real complicated approvals process for both condos as well as rental apartments. And a third issue is that electrical capacity in our existing multifamily buildings is limited. So you can wind up, if you're not planning carefully for the future, you can wind up doing things in your first couple of installations that will then either need to be ripped out or will prevent you from further expanding maybe 5 years down the line or so. So for all these reasons, it's quite important to think carefully about how we're not just going to accommodate the first couple of EV drivers, but ultimately how we're going to expand and ensure everyone's got the availability to charge in our multifamily buildings. Thankfully, there's approaches, which I'll get to, that enable that to happen. So an important part of that kind of future proofing is making parking spaces what we call EV ready. So this kind of schematic here just illustrates what we mean by EV ready. It's only showing one parking space, but the basic idea holds true if this is a multifamily parkade with 100 parking spaces in it. An EV ready parking space is going to be one that has an adjacent electrical outlet where you can, in the future, install an EV charger or EVSE, EV supply equipment. So you don't necessarily need to get the EV charger installed immediately, but you make that an easy, simple, straightforward process by getting all the electrical capacity that's necessary to supply a branch circuit and subsequently terminating in an outlet that can serve that charging station in the future. And that infrastructure here, all the kind of electrical systems to be able to support that outlet is what we call EV ready parking. And just in terms of what an outlet means, most people probably colloquially think of an outlet as something that you can plug in. That can be an outlet, although in most of these cases, it's actually a junction box where you'll then hardwire in a charging station in the future. So you get an electrician in, they take power from that junction box, wiring from that junction box, and hardwire in your charging station. So an EV ready parking space will have either a junction box or a receptacle beside it ready to install a charging station when the household that uses that parking space gets an EV. As I mentioned, I'll say a little bit about EV energy management systems because they're important technology that's going to enable large proportions of our parking to ultimately feature EV chargers. And I'll also say a bit about charging service providers that help multifamily buildings implement EV charging. So basically, EV energy management systems monitor and control EV loads. So you can think of them as charging stations, EV chargers, that have some intelligence. So this schematic down here kind of illustrates the idea. You've got a branch circuit that's coming from an electrical panel located somewhere in your parkade. And that branch circuit goes out, and in this case is serving 3 parking spaces here. So if only one vehicle comes in and parks, it can get the full capacity of that branch circuit. Let's say it's a 40 amp branch circuit, and charge at a relatively fast rate. So if it's a Tesla Model 3, it's going to get about 50 kilometers per hour of charge and be able to cover most people's daily driving distances in an hour or two. 50 kilometers per hour of capacity to charge your vehicle. If multiple vehicles are parked and plugged in at the same time, then the chargers communicate with one another across some sort of network. Oftentimes it's cellular. It could also be wireless internet. It could be an Ethernet cable in the wall. They'll communicate with one another, and they'll throttle down their consumption so that they don't exceed the capacity of this branch circuit and trip the breaker. So what that does is, with a given amount of electrical capacity that's there and available in your building, let you serve a lot larger proportion of parking spaces with that finite amount of electrical capacity that exists. And it also lets you make more efficient use of the copper wire that you're going to need to deploy. Copper is expensive, so your wiring can be, an important part of the cost of all this stuff. And this way you can share that wire over a reasonable amount of parking spaces. So those times when multiple vehicles are charging at the same time, they will be charging at a slower rate. So you'll get less kilometers per hour that you're charging. But the large majority of the time, that's just fine. In a residential context, it's not like everyone's coming home needing 500 kilometers worth of range every night. Someone might be, and that's okay. But most people are coming back having, really just gone their regular commuting distance. And then you add sort of some safety factors and buffers. But you're not going to need the sort of full potential of level 2 charging to every parking space. Rather, you can get away with a reasonable amount of load sharing that can significantly reduce costs while still ensuring that everyone's got a great charging experience and gets fully recharged for the next morning, because you've got all night to charge, and you can get away with a certain amount of sharing. So the basic idea is that this can significantly reduce costs while providing effectively the same experience for drivers. I won't spend too much time on this, but just to note that there's a variety of different types of electrical configurations that can be used. So you can share across a branch circuit, like one circuit coming off of an electrical panel is a branch circuit. You can also sort of share at the panel level. And there's even some systems that let you monitor how much power is being delivered to a building. And if the capacity of that is ever approaching the building's capacity, it can throttle up and down the vehicle systems. That kind of service monitoring is relatively uncommon, but can be an important tool in the toolbox in a few, types of buildings. Most buildings for these implementing EV charging in a multifamily building will keep it relatively simple and just use circuit sharing, this kind of one in the top left. So again, load management like that, really important type of strategy to enable EV charging at scale. Maybe I'll just go to this to demonstrate that, and I'll go back to this slide on what are EV charging service providers. So this is showing a feasibility study that my previous employer, AES Engineering, did for a multifamily building in Vancouver. It had 153 parking spaces, And we did this costing in late 2020. And I was looking at, okay, how can we make every parking space in the building EV ready so that those households will have an easy process data charger over time. So if we were to do it kind of the old fashioned way without any kind of energy management, you would have a dedicated 40 amp circuit to each parking space. That would be quite an expensive undertaking. This 150 some odd unit building, the price tag of that would be $640,000 or about 4,000 per parking space. And then you would have significant energy costs over time. So this was, too much for them to conjure with. But if you do relatively simple load sharing entities, still a decent chunk of coin, but a lot more manageable, $940 cost per residence, and a lot lower cost for monthly energy costs for the drivers too. Now, the reason those monthly energy costs are lower is because your demand charges are lower. You do need to then purchase charging stations, and it's typically the residents, the unit owners in the building that will make those purchases of the charging stations. Because they're able to do those energy management functions and will necessarily be networked, they skew a little bit higher in cost, but you, over a couple of years, make that up in your energy cost savings that you're saving as a driver. So this is just to illustrate that there's significant value that can be realized by using those types of EV energy management systems in a sensible way. And for designers and buildings that are willing to be more aggressive with this, there's even further savings you can realize. So in this particular case, downtown Vancouver, the modeling we did suggested you could really get away with pretty aggressive load sharing. So 7 share on 40 amp circuits was deemed feasible, and that would get the cost per parking space down to about $660. So again, just a lot more manageable. It's important to speak with the professionals that are helping you out with these types of projects to understand what's the kind of greatest reasonable extent of load management that's advisable for your building based on the way you anticipate drivers, like how far people are going to drive on a daily basis, basically. So this is just an example again of this costing study. We see similar sorts of trends in pretty much all the buildings that we work with. I did want to also note that it's important to understand the types of services that EV charging service providers provide. So these entities, and there's a number of them. These are a couple of the larger, more active ones in the region, but there's a bunch of others, and it's a pretty dynamic space. So more coming all the time. They basically provide a set of services for multifamily buildings that they work with. So they'll provide the chargers. They let you designate who's allowed to access those chargers and charge with them. There's kind of user interface apps and admin dashboards. Importantly, they help out with billing so that you can reconcile the cost of electricity that drivers are using. So if you drive a typical, your average amount in the city of North Van probably entails about $20 to $25 a month in electricity costs. So, but it varies depending on how far people drive. The person who's regularly, driving every day up to Whistler and back for work is going to have, realize and gender a lot higher electricity costs than the person that hardly goes out at all. So they can bill drivers for a time of a rate that's like reflective of how long they've charged, and it approximates what their electricity costs are. Related to that, they can provide all the data. They of course provide those sorts of EV energy management systems that I just noted. And a range of sorts of customer assistance, operations and management support, and also warranties. And the last thing it's important to note that they can do is help buildings access revenues that may open up in the future. So two notable ones are, one, utilities may in the future provide demand response types of programs, which means they might give offers to buildings or individual drivers that choose to charge at certain times, or can respond to a utility signal saying, hey, the grid's congested right now, power is especially expensive. Can people throttle down how much they're consuming? They can help support and automate that. And likewise, there's BC's low carbon fuel uh, requirement that provides opportunities for buildings to generate carbon credits. So it's useful to ask these sorts of service providers about the ways that they'll be able to help your building monetize opportunities there. Really quick, basically every major city in British Columbia has now established requirements that all new construction be EV ready. Vancouver and Richmond adopted this in 2018, and most of the others followed by 2020. So we're just now getting to sort of the first tranche of these large buildings that now have 100% EV ready parking. And that makes it a lot easier for the residents in those buildings to get access to at-home EV charging. So it's important to be aware of that, to be competitive with that kind of new construction that is now, coming onto market. That every new building going forward is going to have that kind of future proofing and that sort of convenience for the residents that live there. And it's an idea to try to replicate that through upgrades and electrical renovations in existing buildings. Which brings us to thinking about how do we implement EV ready upgrades in our existing multifamily buildings. So as I've been alluding to, there's kind of two broad strategies to help or whereby multifamily buildings can implement EV charging infrastructure. The first is what I'd call a comprehensive EV ready retrofit, where you undertake one large electrical renovation to make all parking spaces, or at least one per residential unit, EV ready, thereby give it that simple process to future-proof the building, or to allow drivers to install EV charging in the future. The second is in what BC was most common up until a couple of years ago, and in most of North America is still the most common way to do things. And that's through just adding a couple of EV chargers at a time. So this table compares and contrasts these two different approaches to things. That comprehensive EV ready retrofit, it will be a larger one-time upfront cost, but because of economies of scale and because of being able to optimize for load management designs, you're really going to wind up seeing a lot lower life cycle costs through that kind of approach. Whereas if you're adding, let's say, 2 EV chargers in your visitor parking just to satisfy your first couple of early adopters, each of those might be, let's say $10,000. So you're going to have sort of a lower initial cost, but a much higher life cycle cost because, after your early adopters adopt, your next wave of EV adopters are going to move into your building and you're going to need to expand. So over the life cycle of a building, this will be much more expensive. Now, the BC average cost that we've seen, if you're doing 100% EV ready retrofit, the average, though it really varies per building, has been about $1,300 per parking space to make each parking space EV ready, and then the owners might pay $2,000 when they adopt EVs to hardwire in those charging stations. For those incremental additions, the average cost has been around $9,000 or $10,000 to install that. So you can see that there really is value in that kind of more comprehensive approach from a life cycle cost basis. It's also going to be more convenient because through this kind of comprehensive EV ready retrofit approach, you'll have the EV charger located in people's assigned parking spaces. So that household goes home, parks where they always park, and just every night takes the 3 seconds to plug in their EV. Whereas with that incremental approach, often, although not always, we see that in shared parking areas. Now, this kind of comprehensive thing is really, it takes a lot of planning up front. There's a lot of process to successfully implement this sort of project. But once that's done, it's a simple process for drivers to implement your EV Ready retrofit. Whereas every time you need to go and install EV charging in a condominium, typically it's uncertain. It can be lengthy if your strata is not necessarily on board, relatively complicated. So for that reason, um, most folks that look at this space agree that it's ultimately a lot more convenient and a lot better future proofing to do that sort of comprehensive EV ready retrofit approach. Uh, there are incentive programs in BC that'll help you do either type of approach. So if you're doing sort of incremental upgrades, you can use the standalone EV charger program, and you can get $2,000 per charging station, up to $14,000 per multifamily building. So it'll cover 7 charging stations installed. Or you can take advantage of the EV Ready rebate program. And to do that, you ultimately need to implement at least an EV ready parking space for each residential unit. And there's 3 components to that program. There's firstly support for an EV ready plan, also for your EV ready infrastructure, actually implementing this. So that's where the most significant incentives are. And then there's money for charger rebates. So I'll say a little bit more about this. Basically how it works is you'll do what's called an EV Ready plan, or it's essentially a feasibility study, where 75% of the cost, up to $4,000 with the City of North Van's top-up incentive. It's only $3,000 outside of the City of North Van, except in other cities where they do similar top-ups. Of the cost of that EV Ready plan is covered. So this is a professional strategy which gives you a good sort of schematic electrical plan for what you're going to do and a cost estimate to inform buildings budgeting. And then there's the EV Ready infrastructure rebate. So this is $700 per parking space. Again, when you include the city top-ups, $700 in the City of North Van, $600 outside of it, to install the electrical infrastructure that's required to make that at least 1 parking space per residential unit EV Ready. And that goes up to a maximum of $140,000. So basically, suppose that's if you get 50% of the value that for buildings with up to 200 parking spaces, that would be EV Ready. That'll cover 50% plus of that cost. And then there is $1,400 per EV charger, up to, again, $14,000. That's 10 EV chargers that can be supported through this type of process made EV Ready. So how do you implement these types of projects? I'll walk through what I would say is the somewhat sequential, although some of this stuff might be a little bit iterative type of process. I'd say it makes sense to have a kind of ad hoc working group on this stuff that's working with your strata council to help manage this type of work, and you want to involve professionals who know what they're doing to help you implement these types of projects. Probably one of the first most important things to do is to understand how parking is organized in your building. It's usually the case that a household, a unit, will have a long-term right to a particular parking space. So the parking space could be limited common property, or it could be common property, but there's long-term leases associated with it. It could even be stratified. In those cases, usually those households will have a long-term right to that parking space, and it makes sense for them to be the ones that would pay for and own the EV chargers. Some buildings might be common property, in which case it might make more sense for the condo not just to pay for the EV Ready retrofit, but also to pay for the charging stations that are ultimately in place. So you want to basically understand how parking is organized in your building and think about what are going to be the implications for how you would ultimately manage your EV charging infrastructure. I then also think it's important early on to consider, what are your shared values? What are your guiding principles for the project? it's worthwhile having these as you're trying to make a decision, I think. So just, do you collectively value cost efficacy? Is important to future-proof and ensure fairness so that all the folks in the building will ultimately be able to access EV charging, not just your early adopters? Do you want to make a sort of commitment to having more competitive construction tendering processes? So you're not necessarily just going to direct award to one contractor. You're going to try to get multiple bids for the EV ready work. That sort of thing is useful to ask yourselves. And maybe in parallel to establishing those principles, or thereafter, engaging owners to get a better sense of whether your building's at a point where it could seriously consider an EV ready upgrade. So in order to, implement this kind of major electrical renovation, you're going to need to get support at a general meeting for that work to be done, which means you're going to have 75% of the people in your condominium on board to spend the money, and there'll still be some money to spend after you get those incentives to do this type of work. So it's worthwhile determining whether you've got a chance to get there. You don't have to be sure. I think it's really worthwhile going ahead and doing the kind of feasibility assessments, even if you're not sure that you'll ultimately move ahead. But it is useful upfront getting a gut check about whether or not this type of thing could possibly have legs. More and more, I think buildings are seeing the writing on the wall, and they know that, hey, it would be really nice just to solve this problem, not need to worry about it perennially. There's incentives that are available now that might not last for long. The city's generously topping it up. Like, I really do think now is the right time, but it is worthwhile understanding if folks in the building are going to see it the same way. So you do that, you determine, yep, this is something we should investigate more closely. Let's get an EV ready plan. So there is guidance on what needs to be in this plan that are part of the CleanBC Go Electric EV Ready rebate program. So there's sort of standards for what needs to be included to get incentives. I encourage buildings to think carefully about whether they should probably pay a little bit more to get an electrical engineer involved versus go with an electrical contractor. I think there are advantages to having sort of a engineering consultant who's working with you doing the detailed electrical design on the project. Ultimately, after your initial assessment's done, electrical engineers can also help with competitive tendering processes and administering those for buildings, and provide more assurance and coverage in case there's any issues with the work that's ultimately done in the building. That being said, a lot of buildings wind up just working directly with electrical contractors who might then involve engineering consultants to help out with certain aspects of the design. But thinking about those types of elements and what sort of professionals you want involved to do that EV ready plan, I think is really important. Once you get the results of that plan, it's going to tell you how much money it's going to cost to implement this project. So then you need to be thinking about what are your funding options. Maybe you've got a sufficiently healthy contingency reserve that you could spend some of that to cover the residual cost it's going to take to do this EV ready upgrade after incentives. Maybe a special assessment if there's residual cost of $600 for the building, you could get a special assessment that might work best. Potentially, although I'm not aware of it having been done, although it's quite possible it has, you could get a bank loan to cover some of that and spread some of that out and cover it in strata fees. So it's a useful thing about what are those different types of funding options for how you're going to support that project. Then you want to finalize which EV charging service provider you're going to work with. Options for those EV charging service providers will typically be recommended in your EV ready plan. A lot of buildings actually are sort of work with one EV charging service provider in mind from the beginning because they will have relationships with particular contractors. And then you'll have a AGM or a special general meeting where you're going to decide whether to pursue the EV Ready upgrade. So you would draft resolutions that would establish the funding envelope for the project based on your EV Ready plan, so what the building's willing to spend to do this type of work. You'd have resolutions that will establish the either rules or bylaws for how you're going to manage that infrastructure, setting out the rules for how residences, unit owners are allowed to install EV chargers. You want to work with either a property manager that's experienced with drafting that type of resolution, or maybe get some legal advice just to make sure that that's all properly set up. Then you get pre-approved for your rebates. There'll need to be some detailed electrical design that's done, and then a competitive construction process if that's the route that you're going. The EV Ready retrofit is designed. You've now got a beautiful junction box that's beside your parking space, and the peace of mind that you're going to be able to add an EV charging station if and when required. You're going to finalize your contract with your EV charging service provider. And of course, as part of that construction process, you're going to have the appropriate permitting and commissioning of any EV chargers that are installed. So it's a high level walkthrough of what this kind of process looks like. It's definitely takes sort of some thought and engagement. But at the end of the day, it's going to wind up providing buildings with a lot more value than just installing a couple of EV chargers in your visitor parking. That might work, for the first year, and then you're going to be running into the issues of needing to expand all over again. So I'll just share a quick case study wrapping up here. This was, I believe, the first EV Ready retrofit ever done back in 2019, and it was in West Vancouver. There's 46 underground parking spaces. They went for a 4-share on 40 amp branch circuit type of configuration. The electrical engineer was my former employer, AES Engineering, and Power Pros Electrical was the electrical contractor. They're great. Steve Abercrombie's a very knowledgeable guy. They implemented ChargePoint, so the charging service provider was ChargePoint. And this actually was relatively more expensive than some of the buildings that we're seeing, but the cost worked out to be about, I believe all told, when you include the electrical design and all the labor and everything, was around $1,500 per EV Ready parking spaces. And then each of the EVSC installed cost those individual unit owners an additional $2,300. So some buildings are more expensive than this. I'd say on average, it has been actually less expensive, although with construction cost escalation, things are of course changing. I'll finish up here just to share some resources. So there's an entity, Plug-in BC, supported by the province. They have EV advisors who can share the kind of information I provided and a lot more. They provide up to 5 free hours of advice, and that can include presentations to your Strata Council on these range of incentives and the charging installation process and the benefits of implementing this type of infrastructure. Plug-in BC has a guide. There's a template request for proposals for Stratas to solicit quotes for an EV Ready plan. There's also a template survey that you can use to survey your building, and vetting questions to help you choose the right contractor for your EV Ready plan if you're going to be using a contractor. Likewise, similar sorts of questions could be good if you're asking an electrical engineer to do this type of work. And where you're going to apply for these types of rebates is here at this link to get to BC Hydro's electric vehicle page. They administer the incentives that the province funds, and conveniently, the City of North Vancouver top-up is automatically applied, so there's no additional process there. Also worth noting that there might be opportunities to get federal money in addition. So in addition to those Clean BC rebates, you can get an additional 25% up to a maximum of 75% of the total project cost, supported by the Zero Emissions Vehicle Incentive Program that's administered by Natural Resources Canada. This is an incentive of up to, like in this case, an additional 25%, up to $5,000 per each EV charging station that's installed. So depending on how many EV chargers actually get installed in that first tranche, you can cover a lot of the cost of the EV chargers and then a fair bit of the cost of the infrastructure to support that EV ready parking space as well. So it's useful to encourage the consultants that'll be helping you implement these projects to look into whether or not they could directly apply to the ZVIP program to help make these projects happen. Although I will say it is more process. It does take time. Time is money. And, we shouldn't underestimate how lengthy the process can be when you're applying to ZVIP and trying to wait to get that type of stuff approved for a single building. Okay, this is back to those resources that I just mentioned. Hope that's all valuable content for you. I'm happy and really looking forward to answering any questions that you have to the best of my ability. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Brendan. There are lots of questions in the chat, so I'm sorting through them, but a couple easy ones that I can answer just to give you a tiny break. Someone asked the number of participants attending tonight. We have 51 attendees. And will this presentation be available? Yes, it will be posted to our EV Ready webpage on the city's website. Okay, there's a couple of questions about examples or statistics around increase to property value for condos with EV charging infrastructure.
It's a great question. I get asked it all the time. I'm afraid I don't have a good answer for you because no one has commissioned that study yet. Dunsky would be interested in doing it if there's any policymakers out there that are interested in having that done. But I can't say like the average costs. Anecdotally, I mentioned that new construction is EV ready. It's required to be EV ready. And then some developers are spending a bit of money and installing the charging stations. So they fully make it ready, like, they're able for households to then plug in their vehicles. How much it'll cost for developers to install those charging stations, how much they'll charge potential buyers, I think varies. But I've heard of, not just one off, but, a number of different accounts of people being, saying, hey, we're willing to spend $10,000 or $15,000 so that we've got access to at-home charging. I wouldn't expect that at all to be the average, but there is also like this growing number of people that are quite keen to have at-home charging and are willing to spend what to me are surprising amounts of money just to have that kind of peace of mind and have that available. So my guess is that it's not negligible. I think, frankly, the cost will ultimately average out to how much it costs to install as the market sort of starts to get a sense of these things. So, I'm imagining that it'll increase your property value by roughly how much it's going to cost buildings to implement this type of work, which, as I noted, the average cost to date over the last couple of years has been around $1,300 per EV ready parking space. But I could be wrong. It could increase it a lot more, especially if there's a lot of friction to getting this kind of work happening. And so it does become a rare sort of selling feature for the property.
That's great, thanks. Just a couple of questions about service providers. Why do you need a service provider? Why are there monthly fees? And are there ways to avoid the fees?
Great question. You need a service provider because if you're designing for load sharing using EV energy management, you need your charging stations to be able to communicate with one another and function in that management. So you need to install chargers that are going to properly work together. there's increasing use of open protocols, notably the Open Charge Point Protocol, OCPP, that's going to ensure better interoperability of different types of hardware, but it's not by any stretch a case where if a charger is OCPP compliant, it's going to automatically just work like that with that energy management function. That's something that is uh, administered through charging service providers doing that type of work. So that's one thing that they do is like if you're going to have a design that does that kind of load management in terms of what's out there on the market today, pretty much all the ways that charging will then be delivered in your building is predicated on you using a charging service provider. Now they also add, I'd say value in a lot of other ways. That kind of sub-metering how much electricity people are using kind of the metering that's integral to the charging station is valuable. So you can fairly allocate uh, user fees based on approximately how much power households are using. That's a value. I think there's value in terms of them being able to, schedule contractors, troubleshoot, remote diagnostics, and that sort of thing. Um, so the way the market is today, the vast majority of services that are out there are kind of predicated on that. You go with a charging service provider and you're going to pay maybe 20, 25 bucks a month for the user, the network fees that they charge. Frankly, there are other business models that can be imagined and that maybe, some entities are working on, but in terms of what's out there on the market today, that's kind of the way it's structured. Things could move another way in the future, in which case, buildings that choose charging service providers with open systems might be able to switch to a different sorts of model. But I'd say that is the way things are looking today. I will note, like, it kind of stings saying, oh, shoot, someone's going to charge me 20 bucks a month. What real value are we getting here? And, I can hear that. At the same time, the amount of money households that are switching from gasoline vehicles to EVs are going to be saving in maintenance fees and gasoline costs just absolutely dwarf that. So it's something that we might need to eat in terms of getting the additional benefit. I wouldn't want buildings to not do this because they begrudge that the EV drivers are going to have to pay those service fees. Is my I'd say informed take on it.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions about electrical capacity upgrades. So a lot of the content tonight was about sort of the strata side of things, but what about the challenges with electrical capacity in buildings and potential solutions there?
Yeah, great question. So the good news is that in the vast majority of multifamily buildings in the Lower Mainland, there is sufficient electrical capacity to allow every parking space to be EV ready and ultimately feature an EV charger if you design from the front for reasonable amounts of load management. So by reasonable, I mean like maybe it's 4 share on 40 amps, or you could go even more aggressive and then you're going to have uh, an even better likelihood of being okay. But, I've been sort of peripherally involved in projects like it must be like 60 or 70 multifamily existing multifamily building retrofits of this nature, uh, evaluating the potential for that. Only one of them needed an electrical service upgrade after we looked at a reasonable level of load sharing. So the good news is you will typically not need to get a new electrical service. Uh, and that is good news because that can be pretty expensive. Sometimes it's not too expensive. Sometimes it's really expensive and is going to be a challenge, like really challenge the project economics and the viability of doing this kind of thing. So definitely you want to work with engineers or contractors that are thinking about, all right, how can we avoid those types of electrical service upgrades to do this type of work.
Mhm. Great. And on that note, some questions around finding good contractors. Is there a list of qualified contractors that's available? What's your recommendation for finding one?
Yeah, I think Plugin BC does have a list of contractors that are available. Maybe, and I apologize that I don't know that for sure off the top of my head. I would also say, it's worthwhile considering not just contractors, but uh, engineering consultants that are involved in this. So, my former employer, full disclosure, AES, but they have been fairly involved in this. Tego Group, WSP might do a little bit of this, but there's, a variety of um, contractors that are uh, fairly expert in this. I'd first touch base with the EV advisors at Plugin BC to see if they can provide the most up-to-date list of those contractors that are doing this type of work.
Great. There's a couple of questions about the funding for the grants and how long they'll be available. I can say the city's top-ups are first come, first serve, and we have limited funding for that. For the province's rebates, Brendan, maybe you have more insight, but I know, yeah, there's 79 million over 3 years was announced in the last budget for the program, but I haven't heard any more about how
Yeah,
that's
and I
going.
believe that was for not the EV Ready program alone, it was for the full suite of
Oh,
charger programs, although this is like a major component of that. So yeah, I mean, get it while it's hot. It's that will go a long way, but I don't think it can do every building in BC.
mhm. One question about, yeah, getting council members on board. Are there sort of best practices for winning over council boards?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I'm apologize if I don't have like the silver bullet type of solution to convince people for you. I think doing your homework and coming prepared and being persistent is worthwhile. I think also getting some consultants that are willing to chat with your council can be a useful type of strategy. Um, Again, getting the EV advisors, just ask council if they'd be willing to have a presentation here. And in my experience, a lot of the time, it is just sort of persistence, or it takes sort of some soak time for people to realize that the writing on the wall is there and that this transition is happening. And of course, it is somewhat predicated on the demographics of buildings as well. Like some buildings, there's a lot of the residents that aren't going to be buying new vehicles, and that makes it a lot less likely that they're going to be thinking about EVs in the immediate term, and that's okay. So there is, those types of dynamics, and there's the sort of buildings that tend to move forward on this, and that can be tough to control. But I'd say just, ongoing respectful, thoughtful engagement on this and building up a degree of competence in the subject matter can go a long way. I hope that's kind of useful feedback, but that's sort of the best that, I can see actually working in my experience is helped folks that have done this. I've got a colleague, he's a young guy, he's got in a building with a lot of retirees, and it took him, even though he's an engineer working exactly in this type of space, took him a year and a half of just kind of, wasn't a full-time job or anything, but engaging with his neighbors on this to get them to yes to implement this type of project. So first he had to, over a number of months, get them to yes on just spending the money on an EV ready plan, that feasibility study, and then it took about a year to get to yes, um, doing a couple of presentations to the group, walking through what were their concerns or holdups, and making the case for why this is a good kind of thing to do. But in that time, he stayed very, friendly, neighborly, and I think like won people over with his growing amount of knowledge of this sort of sector and why this is a good idea.
And in terms of inviting someone to come and give a presentation to strata councils, is that something that like a number of consulting firms would offer, or is it a common service?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of individuals at a few firms, like, I'm thinking of Don Chandler at AES Engineering, where this is just like a real passion project. The Vancouver Electric Vehicle Association's just a wonderful bunch of folks as well. So it can be worthwhile reaching out to them and seeing, hey, is there anyone that does that sort of thing? But some folks at certain consultants will do that type of thing. But I also think the EV advisors at Plug-in BC actually get compensated to do that sort of thing, and that won't cost you money to pay for consultants' time, because there are a few like really knowledgeable people who do volunteer their time to help people think about this stuff, but they can only do so much. So it's worthwhile reaching out to the folks at Plug-in BC at that EV advisor at pluginbc.ca email.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, just being mindful of time, I think I'll just ask one more technical question. If a strata council member is saying that only 110 volts is needed, and that 220 is overkill, what would you say to that member?
So yeah, that's a tough question. It's an interesting one because for some households, frankly, that 110 outlet can be sufficient, although I'd say suboptimal. For a lot of households, it won't be sufficient. Um, in order to properly do load management with uh, EV energy management systems, you kind of need to pick a horse, and that's going to be load managed level 2. So what I note to them is that level 1 dedicated 120 volt circuits to each parking space. To do your EV ready retrofit to provide that to each parking space will actually be quite a bit more expensive than to do, let's say, 4Share on 40 amp circuits level 2. So 4Share on 40 amp circuits level 2 is going to provide a way better driving experience. It's going to allow the folks who drive long distances, the folks that drive bigger vehicles, like, the Ford F-150 Lightning, not that I'm a great fan of gigantic vehicles. The electric Hummer is kind of a funny thing, but we are seeing most new vehicles that are purchased are these larger SUVs and pickup trucks. They just will not get any kind of material charge. It's really bad future proofing to have 110. And even for like a very efficient sedan, if people drive maybe a bit more than average, 110 is really not going to be uh, useful. But load managed level 2 will be. It's gonna, because you're have that much higher capacity that you're sharing with neighbors, and not all your neighbors are home at the same time all the time. It provides a lot better quality of experience. And to do your initial electrical upgrade, uh, it's actually going to be a fair bit lower cost. So it can be almost not quite as expensive, but almost twice as expensive to wire for level 1 because you've got all that copper in the building versus do your load managed level 2. So I'd really try to encourage them to think about that. Think about if they want to resell their unit, and prospective buyers might it's 60% of cars in Metro Van, like 80% of cars in Canada are, you know, for better or for worse, these SUVs and pickup trucks, new cars that is. So if you're looking to future-proof your unit, I think it's worthwhile doing something that can accommodate the trends and the types of vehicles that people buy. So I would encourage them to think about that. I hope that's useful sort of fodder for that conversation with those types of comments there. And you don't get financial support for the level 1 retrofits. So even absent the incentives, they're twice as expensive or almost twice. And then when you're getting 50% or more of the costs covered by the province and the city of North Van, to my mind, it starts to become a no-brainer, even though you do need to pay for that charging station to be installed, which is a cost, but I just think it provides sufficient improvement to the quality of charging under a range of different ways that parking space might be operated, that it's worthwhile doing.
Mhm. Thanks. Well, thanks for all the answers and for all the questions from everyone. I know we didn't get to all of them, but if you have any remaining questions that you really want an answer to, you can email them to evcharging@cnv.org, where you registered, and we'll try to get an answer for you. Yeah, a reminder that we'd really appreciate your feedback on this session through the survey, which will launch on your browser when I close this webinar. And yeah, thank you again to Brendan for all the excellent information tonight and for all of you to attending. Yeah, we hope this session has been helpful to you, and we're looking forward to hearing your feedback. So thanks again and have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.